Shalom, and welcome to Episode 7 of the Great Tribulation, the Red Heifer Ceremony. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 7, the Red Heifer Ceremony.
Well, Bob, we are now in a point with the series where I think we get to a really crucial issue for both Christians and Jews. Because on one hand, we could say the Messiah, whether it's the first coming or second coming of the Messiah, could come anytime the Messiah wants to come, right?
Exactly.
So the point for us is to know when the real McCoy is coming. That we're not seeing some drummer come into town as an imposter. But what we do know is, in a biblical sense, no red heifer ceremony, no Messiah. I don't care if you're talking Jewish Messiah or Christian Messiah, no red heifer, no Messiah. Correct?
That's because it has to fit into the entire scenario.
All right. Well, then, what you need to do is what Solomon had a problem with. Breaking this down and explaining it to people, because it seems like the information is incomplete out there. Why is that?
The reason Solomon couldn't decipher it was because he didn't know the gospel. He was the 23rd removed great-great-grandfather of Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
No way he could have known those details to put together the whole problem.
Ah, okay. So he was missing some information.
Oh, lots.
But then you have come across this information.
Certainly, now it's easy.
Okay, well, how easy is it?
Well, if you inspect the law and the Talmud for what they call para, which means the cow, and if you look at Scripture, Numbers 19, and if you look at the Gospel, and you know the fact that Yeshua Bar Yosef gave his blood to purify all other people, it fits with the story of the red heifer.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I know we had talked earlier in preparation for this, and you felt that for those folks out there that want to go to their home Bible and take a hard look at this, and with that in mind, what I'd like you to do, since you're feeling that in Numbers chapter 19, particularly verses 1 through 13, is to give us a quick summary of each of those verses. But as you do, blend in the information from Talmud and other sources so that we get that complete picture that Solomon never could. How's that?
Like the Jewish mama says, it wouldn't hurt.
Okay, Boobala, give it a go.
First verse says the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, telling them this ordinance of the law which the Lord had commanded. And he wanted them to speak to the children of Israel and tell them to bring him a red heifer, one that's perfect, one that has no blemish and never even had a yoke on it.
Right.
And besides that, it had to be so perfect that it couldn't have more than one hair other than red. And this heifer would be worth millions of dollars in today's money. They're so rare.
Oh,
and it says, you shall give her to Eleazar, the priest, who had by this time replaced Aaron, apparently, because of Aaron's mistake with the golden calf.
Okay.
And that he may bring her forth outside the camp. That means one Sabbath limit distant from the Holy of Holies. And one shall slaughter her in his sight. There's a priest standing there, and somebody in front of him, between him and the door of the tabernacle, slits the heifer's throat and collects the blood.
Mm-hmm.
And Eleazar shall take some of her blood with his finger, then sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
And if he belches or stumbles or miscounts or anything, if a cloud passes across the sun and shields the door of the temple while he's looking at it, it's all over. You got to go back. New heifer, everything.
Oh,
Of course, square A
boy.
has to be perfect.
That's intense.
And one person shall burn the heifer in his sight, the priest's sight, her skin and her blood and her flesh and her dung, the whole guts, feathers, and all shall he burn. And the priest then takes cedar wood and hyssop. Hyssop is a scroungy weed that grows in great proliferation in the Mideast, and scarlet material. And we found out later what that is.
Just out of curiosity, what is scarlet material?
It's the same cinnamon-laden incense that's used in the altar of incense in the temple.
Okay.
Cinnamon is sort of red,
Uh-huh.
not really red, but it's reddish brown.
Got it.
That's what's going on there.
Okay.
Then the priest shall, going back, they cast that into the midst of the burning of the heifer. And they do that when the heifer bursts, thrown in the fire, and it expands in its belly. Now, this is kind of gory, but when the heifer bursts, then they throw in this other material. And red smoke will emanate from it because of the contents of some of those ingredients that they threw in the fire. And a priest down at the temple will see that, and he will know that that action is completed. And then it gets really complex. The priest shall wash his clothes and shall bathe his body in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until the evening.
Mm-hmm.
My own interpretation of that means that the evening is the end of the age, and that's what's signifying here.
Mm-hmm.
He'll be unclean until the end of the age. And he who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he shall be unclean until the evening. That means they can't come into the temple, and the temple is a type of heaven. And so that's the picture that we see here.
Mm-hmm.
And a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and lay them outside the camp in a clean place. A clean place, as we discovered before, was preferably something that's insulated from the soil beneath by at least 4 finger breadths of air and resting on stone above that.
Mm-hmm.
Dead airspace, and the stone insulates from any sin or death that's down below. And it should be kept for all the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of sprinkling. This is the water of purification. If you walk across a dead body of a prehistoric Edomite and you don't know it, well, that's too bad. You got to be clean anyway. So just in case you did, you have to be sprinkled by this for certain ceremonies, not every ceremony, but for certain ceremonies in temple worship.
Mm.
And he who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. You see this all the time, until the evening. And that means they can't go back into the temple until they've done this. And the children of Israel and the proselytes who sojourn among them, this shall be a statute forever. And that verse or phrase, that last one I read there, shall be a statute forever, is what the rabbis interpret as meaning that you have to find the original ashes. They have kept the ashes. There have been 7 heifers that have been qualified, burned, and their ashes are all in that kalpeh. And it includes the one that Eleazar burned. The first heifer ashes are in that urn. And they have to do that because of that particular verse that we just read. Shall be a statute forever. And he who touches a dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. This is all about death. and death is equated to sin. God was giving them a message of equating the fact that death is sin, and if you sin, you will have a second death, and you will not be with him in New Jerusalem. If you're not written in the book of life, you'll have a second death, and you will go into the lake of fire for eternity.
Okay.
So he's giving them sort of a message of that here.
Okay.
The pitch here is that this is a picture of, you take a perfect living being. I mean, it is absolutely perfect. And you kill it. And then you use its ashes or blood, and you mix it with living water, water that's being poured and stirred at the same time, not stagnant at all. And you put a pinch of that ashes in there, and you sprinkle it on other people, all of whom are unclean, and it purifies them. Now, this is a picture of Messiah, the Redeemer of Israel. All at the Seder ceremony, each Passover, I think about a dozen times, they say, "May a Messiah, son of David, come speedily in our day." That's for the reason that we talked about the Jewish rapture earlier. He's going to bring them to Jerusalem to see their Redeemer when he arrives. And that's going to be a really big show. I mean, he's going to come in the sky, and everybody on the surface of the earth is going to see him coming, and they're going to know who it is. And like it says, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess. There ain't going to be no doubt about who that is. He is going to be in charge.
Okay.
That's what this is about.
All right. But in modern day sense, are people as confused from what you see as Solomon was? Because, he didn't have a full portfolio to work with, so to speak.
In our book, this is explained in detail, which we haven't got time to go through here. But it's a very complex story, but it's a very beautiful story, and it's worth the reading. And as you encouraged people before, they should get out Numbers 19 and read through it. They won't find the whole answer there, but at least they'll have a part of it.
And where do they go for the rest of the answer?
The rest of it is in the Talmud, in the Para Tractate, and in the 5 books of the Gospel.
Okay. Well, in that event, when we come back in the next segment, I really want to dive into the meaning of all this and the value of a perfect heifer, not in the historical sense as you've just described it, but in the future sense, because events in the Middle East are moving along at let's just say a very disquieting pace. Predictions are coming to pass. And so let's put this in the context of the future, because we know we've got to understand it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the Battle of Gog and Magog, remember we talked about that earlier,
Right.
Only 1/6 of that invading army of perhaps hundreds of thousands of soldiers, only 1/6 of them are going to survive. And it says in in Ezekiel, that it will take the Israelis 7 months to bury the dead. And by this time, they are observing the law, and they're going to have a whole lot of ashes.
Wow.
To keep themselves pure after touching all these dead Russians and Arabs.
Let's get into this a lot deeper in the next segment. Okie doke?
Okay.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the second part of Episode 7, The Red Heifer Ceremony.
All right, Bob, as we closed out of the last segment in this show, the Red Heifer Ceremony, we were starting to look forward into the future and talking about, well, they're going to need a lot of red heifer asses to bury a whole lot of bad guys. So I know you cover this in great length in the book, but I'd like for you to just paint the big picture for this. I mean, what's the meaning of it all? What's the value of having a perfect heifer? And I think what is most important for everyone, what is coming next? Okay?
Yes, the next thing that's coming is the rapture, or taking up of Christian believers to be with Messiah. And then, sometime later, temple worship will be resumed. The Antichrist going to make a 7-year covenant to protect Israel from their hostile neighbors. And he is at that time going to permit them to resume temple worship somewhere. We don't know whether it's on the Temple Mount. It could be anywhere in Israel as far as that goes.
Okay.
But that is going to be the first thing that happens. And when that happens, they will have to have purification of all of the temple buildings, the robes that the priests wear, the laver, everything in the temple worship has to be purified by those ashes. As we said, it contains even the original ashes that Eleazar sacrificed. So that was hidden in Kidron, in the Qumran Valley. And we believe that
Right.
Vendel Jones recovered it, although they're not talking about it. They don't want anybody to know that they have them because they're so important and so valuable.
Isn't the red heifer mentioned in the Quran?
Yes, the first book in the Quran is the cow, and they're a little bit mixed up on the color. They call it kind of an amber color, but they know about the red heifer. They believe that whoever has the red heifer ashes will rule the world. They've read the Bible.
Okay.
They know about the Jews
Okay.
more than some of the Jews know.
So basically, all they got to do is steal the ashes, and they get the mojo.
Oh, well, it wouldn't be any good to them.
Why would the ashes be of no use to them?
If a Gentile were to even touch the kalal, the urn,
Uh-huh.
the ashes would be worthless. They would be disqualified.
So it can only be a Jew.
Right. A clean Jew. Like when they came back from Babylon, I don't remember if we talked about this before, but it wouldn't hurt to review it. When they came back from Babylon, nobody was clean. The Babylonians didn't have much patience for Jewish burial practices, and they didn't have the ashes with them. They didn't have a temple or anything like that. And so when they got back, they said, "Oh, what'll we do?" And somebody came up with the idea, we'll have to raise children who are clean, raise them and bring them up in a place where they cannot be defiled by unclean soil underneath. And they found a place that was a stone cavity, and they built houses or shacks on top of that, and it was insulated from the soil underneath. There was a dead air space on the stone cavity. And
Right.
wealthy women from Jerusalem brought food and clothing to the pregnant mothers that they brought to the place so that they would have their prenatal period there. And they raised several toddlers by a basis of some criteria. I don't know how, it doesn't tell about that, but they picked a few of them, and then when they were old enough, they put them on doors on top of oxen. Here again, they're insulated from the ground, right?
Right.
And they took them down to the pool of Siloam, and they gave them a cup of water, and the cup was either stone or dung. Dung or stone are clean, ritually clean.
Okay.
And then, since these children were clean, they could touch the ashes. And
Excuse me.
mhm,
Dung is clean?
Yes, ritually clean.
Why is that? I mean, it just is logically speaking, it's what winds up in the septic tank.
It's because it comes from nature, but it's also because God said so. Like he says, who are you to cavil at my commandments?
All right, well, then that's the way it is.
Yeah.
That's the way it is. Okay.
So the children are clean and they can reach in and take a pinch of the ashes and they drop them in the cup. They stir the cup as the water is being poured in to the cup, actually. So it's living water. And they stir the ashes as the water is being poured into the cup. And then they have a batch of ashes that can be used for purification. Now, this next part is so bizarre. Well, I don't know what you're going to think.
Okay, well, just lay it on me.
They took a priest and sat him down in front of a goat. And they got some hyssop branches and they dipped them in this clean ash water and tied them to the horns of the goat. And the priest is facing the goat. And he tapped the goat on the nose, and the goat reacted by lurching his head, and he sprinkles the ashes on the nice priest. And now the priest is, guess what? Clean. And so he can clean you, he can clean me, he can clean somebody else. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then we're on our way. Now, I wasn't sure that they could find the place that they raised the children, the babes, when they came back from Babylon. It might be in the Muslim section of Jerusalem, for all we know, or in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. I drew a sketch in there of a building that they could make that would insulate the children from the ground, and they could be raised in that kind of a building. And I wouldn't be too surprised if in the Mea Sharim section of Jerusalem there is something similar structure for this purpose, because they know they're going to need those ashes, and they know they're going to resume sacrifices when the Antichrist, or who the man in Daniel, makes that 7-year covenant. They've read the Tanakh.
All right.
And they want to be ready.
They want to be ready. So then take us through the sequences of what we could possibly being reported in the news in the coming months or years. What kind of news reports are you looking for to know that the red heifer ceremony, they've got a red heifer and the ceremony's been done? What are you looking for?
I'm not looking for it because I'm sure that they're going to keep it secret until they get ready to use it.
Okay.
I don't expect to be here when that occurs, but they will probably march around the city and have a big celebration, much to the consternation of the Muslims. When that fellow makes that 7-year covenant with Israel, that's going to be headlines like you wouldn't believe. Here he promises to protect Israel from Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Syria, etc., etc., etc. And wait a minute. How's he going to do that? Who does he think he is? That's what the Russians and these nations that I just mentioned, that's what they're going to say. And Israel will be lulled into a feeling of security. In Ezekiel's prophecy, it says Gog and Magog will say, let us go to the unwalled villages and take a spoil. Well, the unwalled villages are a euphemism for Israelis thinking that they are secure. They've been lulled into complacency. They don't have to watch out for themselves anymore. It's hard for me to believe that they would fall for something like this, but that's what it says in the prophet Ezekiel. One thing about Ezekiel, his prophecies are in chronological order. The last prophecy, Ezekiel was fulfilled was on May 20th, 1948, when Israel became a nation. And Israel said, "And you will never again cease to be one nation." Some people should read that. Then, so the next prophecy is Ezekiel 38 and 39, and that is the battle of Gog and Magog. And the rabbis in Talmud make no bones about it, that is the people whom we call Russia now. They lived north of the Black Sea, called the Scythians, and they were the most feared people in the whole known region at the time. They were just absolutely ruthless.
Yes.
That's the people they know are going to make this invasion.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's a tough life. You ask Russians, very brutal country. It used to be where
Yes.
if you bought a piece of land, you owned the souls on that land.
You remember how the Nazis were so fearful when the Russians, they wanted the surrender to the Americans or the British.
Yep. But early in Operation Barbarossa, I know one of the Wehrmacht officers said something to the effect of invading Russia, Germany is like an elephant attacking an anthill. You can stomp on hundreds or thousands of ants and kill them, but in the end, they'll swarm all over you and eat you to the bone.
Wow.
That's exactly what happened.
Exactly. But in some ways, the Russians are comprised of a mixture similar to us. There are Russians who are of Asiatic ethnic order, and there are Russians that are probably even from Abrahamic. But the real Russians that we've been talking about, the so-called white Russians, are the ones that are descended from the Scythians, most fearful people.
Oh, yeah. They are a fearsome people. So let's do this. I think we've really had a good chat on the red heifer, and bottom line is no red heifer, no Messiah. So I think in this third part of this episode, let's talk about how you became a Goy Yeshiva scholar. Okay?
Sure.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the third and final part of Episode 7, The Red Heifer Ceremony.
Well, Bob, in this third segment of the Red Heifer Ceremony, I'd really like to take a little time to do some preparatory work for the next episode in the series, which is called The Jewish Rapture. And I'm sure people are saying, "Say what?" And they're wondering about that.
I think that's a unique term.
I got a say what question for you. How did you become a Goy Yeshiva scholar?
I was a follower and supporter of a TV evangelist and an author of books on biblical prophecy. And he was going to speak at Messianic Synagogue, which I had never heard of before. I never knew of such a thing. And it was a Temple Aron Kodesh in Lauderhill. And it was claimed to be the largest congregation of Messianic synagogues in the United States at that time.
By the way, when was this?
Probably about the 70s, early 70s.
Okay.
Well, we sat there. It was a very humble building, an old medical building, dentists and doctors.
Ah, the smell of Novocaine.
It was very, very humble and full of activity, and men wore yarmulkes and talits, and I was never welcomed into any Christian church the way I was welcomed there, and I was a complete stranger, but they really gave us the red carpet treatment. They'd never seen us or heard of us before. But anyway, I got in there and we got a seat, and I looked over to my right, and in the front row was seated a gentleman with a big black beard and a big black hat and black glasses and a black coat. And I said, my goodness, that must be a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I knew what rabbis looked like. And they first did the candle lighting because this was a Shabbat service. They brought the Torah out of the ark, and then they started the teaching portion of the thing. And the first thing they did was introduce this gentleman whose name was Rachmiel Friedland.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave his testimony about how he had become a Messianic Jew. He was in Poland in World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and he was about 14 years old when the Nazis came through, and a Christian family hid him in their cellar. What's he going to do while he's down there? Well, they gave him a Bible and maybe a few other books, and that's all he had for entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And he was down there from 1940 until probably 1944 or 45.
Mm-hmm.
And when he read the Bible, he came to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. And he said, my goodness, God's not a liar. According to this prophecy says that Messiah was already here. And he was really disturbed about this. And so a couple of years later, the war was over, and he came up out of the cellar, and one of the first things he did was go and find a rabbi. And he confronted him with this question. And the rabbi said, oh, well, that was about King Herod Agrippa. He lost his life, and that's what that was referring to. Well, Rachmiel Friedland didn't buy that story at all, because it didn't fit what Daniel had said. So he remained in Europe for a short time and emigrated to the United States and began this movement because he was really excited about what he had found.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness sakes, unless God is a liar, this happened and we missed it. And so he started this Messianic Jewish movement. And these Messianic synagogues are comprised, usually, all of them that I've been to anyway, of about 50% evangelical Zionists like myself,
Mm-hmm.
and Messianic Jewish believers. And they dance and sing and their ceremony, you never saw real Christian joy until you've been to one of their Shabbat services, I'll tell you.
Mm.
He went on to tell how he had started this movement and how it had grown. And in fact, it has grown to the fact that it's pretty big in Israel right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some other Messianic Jewish movements, of which Jews for Jesus is not one. Jews for Jesus is a very controversial organization, and I don't know much about it, and I'm not going to go into it. But this Messianic Jewish synagogue thing is almost like going to the first century church, because we so often forget that the first Christians were Jews. Now, the first Christians, those Jewish Christians, did not worship with Gentiles at first.
Mm-hmm.
That came along later after Paul and a few others started ministering to Gentile communities. They act just as Jewish or more Jewish than a lot of Jewish people I've seen. They are very proud of their Judaism, and they worship like I've never seen before. The rabbi was an insurance man,
Mm-hmm.
and he put out notes for the lesson he was going to teach, which was going to take 2 hours. And it was about 6 pages, single spaced, on legal paper.
Whoa, that's big.
And he proceeded to teach about the gospel and connecting it with their Judaic practices. And he gave a wonderful talk. I was never bored during the whole thing. My eyes didn't blink. And I was kind of a long drive from home, too.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a wonderful experience. But I was blessed and greatly moved by Rachmiel Friedland, his testimony. And after the thing was over, I went out, and there were some of his tracts laying there on a little table. And kind of caught my eye. Talmud and Christianity. Oh, well, maybe that's interesting. I don't know anything about Talmud. And so I picked up these tracts and I started reading them. And I found out that, holy mackerel, told about these signs in the temple that disappeared during the 40 years before the temple was destroyed. And it showed exactly where they occurred in the Talmud. And so I went down to my local Temple Israel library. They have one of the finest Judaica libraries in Florida, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The ladies there became very protective of me. Adele Sales and Elsie Leviton were the librarians. They are no longer there, however. I think they finally shut down the library. It's a shame.
That's a shame.
They mothered me along, you know how Jewish mamas are anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But they would also call me if a person called up to ask a question about King so-and-so.
Bob, I got to tell you, this is for a moment for a good old classic Jewish joke, because that's what this really reminds me of, with the temple having you coming in as a consultant. This was many years ago in Eastern Europe, and there was a circuit rabbi, and he's going around to all the small shuttles and answering questions. And he has a carriage and a driver. And so they're going between two small shuttles, and the driver looks over his shoulder at the rabbi and says, "You know, I've been with you for all this time, and I don't see you doing anything I couldn't do." And the rabbi says, "Really, is that so? Okay, well, why don't you pull over and we'll exchange clothes. I'll be the driver and you'll be the rabbi, and let's see what happens." So they do. They go into the next shuttle. And of course, immediately they pull in and everybody swarms around. Rebbe. It's one of these really complex and deep questions. And the driver, dressed like the rabbi, scratches his head and thinks and smiles and looks at them and says, "The answer to your question is so incredibly simple. I'm going to let my driver explain it."
Brilliant.
So they were calling you in for that, and you wound up doing this. But in the process of doing all of this research with Messianic Jews, then leading you to a Jewish temple, and at the time when it was available, one of the best Judaica libraries in Florida, as you said, it really opened a lot of doors for you that, frankly, very few Christians ever walk through.
I started studying the Talmud because I didn't have my own Talmud at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And they had all of the Babylonian Talmud from the Sonsino edition. And a short time later, I met a young lady at another meeting who asked the speaker, "What's the latest on the red heifer?" And he didn't even want to talk about it. He just sloughed her off, rather rudely. And so I went up to her after the meeting and I told her, "I've been studying about the red heifer, and I have quite a few notes, and I would be willing to share them with you." So my then wife, Beth, and I came down to visit them, and I showed them what I had found. And she prayed that I would get my own set of Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll bet you it wasn't a month or two later that Vendell Jones came out with a big special in his bulletin. It said, "Babylonian Talmud, brand new, half price, $275. Wow! Man, I sent my check in for that, and I was on my way. I didn't have to go down to Temple Israel anymore for the Talmud. I went down there for other things, like some commentaries and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and one very wonderful thing happened. I found about the Midrash, where the story of departure of the glory of the temple, the Shekinah, was told. And I wanted to read about that. I read about it in Josephus, but I didn't have the Midrash. And so I went down to them and asked if they had Midrash. "Oh, yes, we have that." And Elsie looked over in the shelves and she couldn't find it. So, well, maybe the rabbi has it. So she went into Rabbi Howard Shapiro's office and asked him if he had the midrash. And she came out and she was crestfallen. She says, "What, now, Bob, I'm sorry, we don't have a midrash." You know what they did?
What?
They bought one for I. Just special for me.
All right.
Then I was able to read that portion of the story of Shekinah and put that together with what I had from Josephus, and I started writing the portion of the book about the red heifer.
Uh-huh.
And one thing led to another. It just kept snowballing. One time I sent my then wife down there. I was at work out at Pratt & Whitney, and I sent her down to Temple Israel Library to find something for me that I'd been thinking about. And so she went down there and she got in the Talmud that I had told her to get into. And she came across, just flipping through there, came across something that caught her eye. There were two Messiahs, Messiah son of Joseph and Messiah son of David. And they were both carpenters. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We already talked about that. But Beth found that just by, shall we say, accident? I don't think so.
Well, I have found these things are not always accidental.
Elsie and I and Adele Sales became real buddies. In fact, when they would have sales of the books in the library that had been there a long time and they wanted to kind of clean things out, she would call me up on maybe Wednesday and tell me that they were going to have a sale and that I could have first grabs on whatever they had before the whole congregation came in there. I have one book up here on my shelf that is a treasure. It's a book about Yerushalayim, and it has the signature of Teddy Kollek.
Okay.
Probably for $1.
Wow. That is a real find.
But that's how I started in my yeshiva self-taught mode. I went on from there, and I obtained, as I told you, some CD-ROMs, one on Talmud and another one on Midrash, and I have another one on the Bible. You never knew there were so many translations of the Bible. Oh, and I also have Eusebius, both of his famous books. I started pouring through those things, and it was, like I say, it was like a snowball. Things just kept connecting to each other, one after another, and I came up with this book that you published that's so beautiful. I mean, 700 pages. There's a blessing on every page. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book, and it's a fun read. It is a fun read. To talk about this, because our next big episode is the Jewish rapture. And I know that title's got to have some people scratching their heads. But if there's someone that's eminently qualified for that, it's you. So let's do that in the next show. Okay?
All right.
This concludes Episode 7, The Red Heifer Ceremony. Next up, please join us for Episode 8, The Jewish Rapture. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com.